renowned thought leader in future proofing. He specializes in helping forward-looking leaders secure their organization's future by forecasting, addressing threats, and maximizing opportunities. He serves as a CEO of the future proofing consultancy, Disaster Avoidance Experts. A best-selling author of several traditionally published books, Dr. Gleb is most well known for his 2019 bestseller, Never Go With Your Gut: How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, published by Career Press, and his 2020 best-selling book, The Blind Spots Between Us: How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships, published by New Harbinger. His groundbreaking thought leadership was featured in over 550 articles and 450 interviews in prominent venues. They include USA Today, Time, Fast Company, CBS News, Fortune Inc. magazine, CNBC, and many more. Dr. Gleb's expertise comes from over 20 years of consulting, coaching, and training. His clients include innovative startups, major nonprofits, and Fortune 500 companies ranging from Aflac to Xerox. His expertise also comes from his research background as a behavioral scientist with 15 years in academia, including 7 as a professor at Ohio State University. In his free time, he makes sure to spend abundant quality time with his wife to avoid his personal life turning into a disaster. To help you take advantage of his groundbreaking expertise, we've asked him to share with us about how event professionals can successfully defeat unconscious bias via the neuroscience of emotional and social intelligence. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Gleb. We're so excited to have you. Take it away.
Of course. Thank you so much, RJB. I really appreciate that warm introduction. All right, everyone. So let's get into it. Let's talk about how you as event professionals can address unconscious bias. And again, this will be based on extensive research in neuroscience, specifically focusing on emotional and social intelligence. I will not be citing research here. I will be very happy to discuss it in the Q&A, but in order to save you time, I will not be citing the actual research here. So that's kind of where it's coming from. Now I'll tell you about the shape of the presentation so you know what to expect. The first part of the presentation will be about the specific judgment errors we make as human beings because of how our brains are wired. You might have heard about cognitive biases as a term. This is what we'll be talking about, and I'll explain what they are for folks who are not so familiar with them later. These are the dangerous judgment errors. So I'll talk about those, some examples of them, and then we will transition into how to identify them and then how to defeat them. So that's going to be the shape of the presentation. That's going to be how it flows. And let's talk about, as the first example of these unconscious biases and kind of the dangerous judgment errors that we make, I want to talk about confidence. Confidence is an important quality. You as an event professional need to be confident in your event planning. You need to be confident in the vendors that you select. You need to be confident that the folks who you invite, if you're organizing the event, you actually get sufficient attendees, and so many other things. Of course, you need to be confident that the pandemic doesn't strike, which sometimes happens, right? And that's a challenging thing. So confidence is a really important quality in unconscious bias, in decision-making around people. You as event professionals have to make decisions around people all the time. And unconscious bias, what is that about? That's about how we make bad decisions about people, how we, without realizing it, whether it's discriminatory decisions or just deviating to even 2 positive assessments of people, 2 negative assessments, 2 positive assessments of people, that causes us a lot of problems. Now, you've probably been taught to be confident. That's an important quality when you're making your decisions. And it doesn't only apply to making people decisions, which is what unconscious bias is about. It applies to all life areas. So for example, driving. Are you an above average driver? How confident are you in your driving skills? When you're driving, it's important to have confidence when you're trying to merge into one lane or another, when you're looking out for other people, doing some defensive driving. It can be tough, especially in California. But for those guests from Seattle as well in Seattle. So I want you to look right now down at the polling options. You will see an option in Zoom polls to answer a question about your driving skills. When evaluating your own driving skills, would you say you're in the top half or bottom half of all drivers? So top half or bottom half of all drivers. So please go ahead. Top half or bottom half yourself. How would you identify? See, 87% of the people voted. Let's get a little bit more. All right, so check out the polling results. So we see that we're pretty evenly split in the top half or bottom half of all drivers. It's good that you can identify yourself where you are in those percentages. And it's important for you to be thinking about your decision-making around people as you're going into this. Now, we tend to be too confident about our driving ability, and all sorts of ability questions when we're making judgments about our driving or about people, both in the negative direction and the positive direction. And so I want to talk about confidence and the challenges of confidence, because there's a phenomenon called overconfidence bias, where we tend to be overconfident about judging ourselves and judging other people. And judging, I don't mean negatively, I mean evaluatively. So when we evaluate other people, evaluate ourselves, we tend to be too confident in those decisions and those judgments. That's called the overconfidence bias. That is one of the dangerous judgment errors I want to talk about right now. So overconfidence bias causes us to be too confident, causes us to make snap judgments, come too quickly to making a judgment around people when we really should wait for some time. For example, there is extensive research showing that when people say they're 100% confident about something, I'll bet the farm, I'll bet the company, I'll bet my career on this, they're right only about 80% of the time. 80% of the time. This is a big problem because it leads us to making major decisions that turn out to be wrong and losing the farm, losing the career, losing the company. That's what you want to be avoiding. And that means that sometimes you will not be, when you're making decisions and when you're feeling confident, you will not be making good decisions around people. So you have to tamp down your confidence around people. It's especially dangerous for those with more expertise and more authority. If you're the leader of your own company, if you've been running a company for a while, that will tend to make it more dangerous. And that is something that you might be confused about. Why would it be more dangerous if you have more expertise and more authority? Wouldn't you be making better judgments? Wouldn't you have more education, information about this? That's unfortunately not the way it works. When we look at our judgment, our decision-making, when we have more expertise and authority, it causes us to be more confident about our judgments, not necessarily more right in those judgments. There was a study comparing younger doctors and senior doctors. So doctors who have a lot of experience, the senior doctors, and younger ones who are just out of medical school. And that they were both given the same case to diagnose, evaluate, say, what's the problem and what would you do in this to solve the problem in the case to help the patient. Well, interestingly enough, they were right at about the same rate. So they had about the same rate of being right in evaluating the cause of the problem and the solution to the problem. But the senior doctors tended to be way more confident than the junior doctors. So that's a problem, that they were way more confident, because when they get additional information, they wouldn't be willing to change their mind. That's what confidence means. And why, you might wonder why. I mean, don't the senior doctors have much more know-how? They do. They have a lot more experience. They have a lot more know-how. But those junior doctors have more fresh information from medical school, so more updated knowledge. So that apparently balances out. And that's just something for you to know about also when you're thinking about which doctor you want taking care of you. So that's the first thing I want to talk to you about, this overconfidence bias. And that leads out into a broader conversation about what's going on. Why do we make these bad decisions? Why do we go with our gut? Our gut, our intuition, our heart, our reactions. We're told by gurus to go with your gut, follow your heart, trust your intuitions, all of these sorts of things. Now, Tony Robbins tells us to be primal, be savage. That's an example of following your gut. Or Malcolm Gladwell tells us to blink, make your decisions in the blink of an eye in his book, Blink. That feels very comfortable. Trusting our gut feels very comfortable, which is why Malcolm Gladwell and Tony Robbins get a lot of money. They tell people what people want to hear, and people will pay a lot of money to be told what they want to hear. It feels very comfortable to us. It feels very intuitive by definition, to trust our intuition, to trust our gut, to trust our heart. But it often leads to disasters in event planning and all sorts of other areas. because our gut, our intuitions, our heart actually evolved for the ancient savannah, not the modern world. That's what they're evolved for. I mean, the modern world with the internet and so on has only been around since the 1990s. Do you think we had time to evolve for it? Of course not. Our intuitions, our gut reactions are evolved for when we were hunters and gatherers living in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people. And that's a big problem for making good decisions about other people, because tribalism is a very powerful force, causing us to make problematic decisions around other people. In the savannah environment, it was very important for us to be tribal. If we weren't sufficiently tribal, we would die. We would be kicked out of our tribe and we would die. And if we weren't, so that was causing us to be very loyal to people and like and care for and trust people who look like us, who share our values, who share our predispositions, who share our preferences, who share our cultural background, educational background. That is one of the aspects of tribalism. Another aspect of tribalism is opposition, hostility to people who we don't feel are part of our tribe. If we weren't sufficiently hostile to members of opposing tribes, they take over our tribe and we die. So you notice we're the descendants of those who didn't die. We're the descendants of those who were loyal to people like us and hostile to those who we felt were part of the outgroup, who were not members of our tribe. That's intuitive to us, nothing to be shamed about or guilty of. Unconscious bias is wired into us as human beings. It's just part of who we are. We need to understand that. There are lots of things that are wired into us that are not helpful in the modern world. In the modern world, you need to engage effectively with people who are very different than you in a lot of ways. But we are wired to make mistakes, serious oversights, to be overcome. For example, in the savannah environment, it was very important for us to make judgments around people in the blink of an eye, very quickly. And because if we didn't make the right judgment, we would die, especially around hostile tribal members. So for evolution, for survival, it was very important in that environment for us to make judgments very quickly. In the modern environment, of course, we're not going to die if we make the wrong decision. It's much wiser for us to wait and gather more information and assess people, not simply on whether they share our appearance, our characteristics, the same cultural background, but that's what causes, but we are wired to do that. We are wired to not wait. We're wired to make immediate decisions, snap judgments, evaluate people immediately. That's a big problem. And overconfidence bias is only one out of over 100 dangerous judgment errors. And a number of them combine into what we call unconscious bias, discriminatory evaluations of people. These dangerous judgment errors are what are called cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are deviations away from the ideal way of making decisions. If we didn't have that evolutionary background, if we didn't have all the wiring in our brain, how would we make decisions in the best possible way in the modern world? Sufficiently gathering information, taking appropriate amount of time, evaluating people effectively, changing our minds as we get more information, and so on. That is a very difficult thing to do because of all the deviations in our minds, the cognitive biases, over 100 of them. And again, they come from our evolutionary background and the structure of our brain. You might have heard of things like the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala. Not going to go into them. You can ask questions in the Google form, and we're going to talk about them later if you're interested in that. But that is something that you should know about. That's where these problems come from. Now, I want you to think about another question in the Zoom polling. Was there ever a time when you were very confident you were right, but you turned out to be badly wrong? I know there was an example when in my company that I run, Disaster Avoidance Experts, it's a training, consulting, coaching company on future proofing, I promoted someone to the position of assistant manager from the team. I thought that she would do really well. Unfortunately, I was wrong with my assessment. She did not do well. She was micromanaging people. She couldn't let go of her previous roles and relationships. And so that was an example of a bad decision on my part. What about you? I see about just over half of the people voted. So let's give folks 5 more seconds to make your voice heard. 5 more seconds. All right, so we see that for 85% of you, so the large majority, this is something that happened to you, that you experienced. You are very confident in something, but you turned out to be badly wrong. And that's likely an example of one or other of these dangerous judgment areas. Yes, RJB, it's good that you're honest, the poll is anonymous. So not a worry about anyone revealing the answers. It's one of the reasons I use polling rather than chatting on this one. Now, let's talk about some other dangerous judgment errors. And to begin, I'll answer a question that probably a number of you started thinking about when I started speaking. Not when you saw me, I look like a normal white mainstream American male, right? But when I started speaking, because obviously I have an accent. So it's something that a lot of people wonder is, where are you from? Where are you from? I'll be happy to answer that question. I'm from a small country called Moldova. It's so small, it's in Eastern Europe, that you need an arrow to point out where it is. You can't write the letter on it. It's in that little corner over there, a small landlocked country. I was born in 81, and my parents took me to the United States when I was 10 in 1991. So that's how I ended up here. But I still have that accent. Now, my parents settled in New York City, and that was a cultural melting pot, just like Northern California is a cultural melting pot. It's a very diverse area. As I'm sure you know, people with very different accents live there. And so I didn't feel the need to let go of my accent. My parents taught me to be proud of my cultural heritage. Many immigrants chose to let go of their accents, especially ones who didn't settle in Northern California or New York City. But I chose to keep my accent because they wanted to fit in. I was taught to be proud of my cultural heritage, and I fit into my context in New York City. Now, unfortunately, when I was getting my PhD, when I was studying these dangerous judgment errors, I realized that was kind of a dumb decision, unfortunately, because of a phenomenon called accent discrimination. At the time, I lived in North Carolina, so I went to UNC Chapel Hill for my PhD. And so that was definitely an example of people having accent discrimination against me. I definitely felt it in North Carolina. It's a false perception of being less trustworthy. That's what accent discrimination is about. People perceive those with foreign accents as being less trustworthy than the mainstream American accents or even regional American accents. That's a false perception, of course, but that is something that is very real. There is a real discrimination against people like me. So in that sense, and that is something problematic. There's only actually one category of foreign accent to which this doesn't apply, and that's the British accent. They still have that cultural imperialism going for them. So the British accent, not perceived as less trustworthy, but other foreign accents, they are, unfortunately. And this is part of a broader phenomenon. Now, the accent discrimination is not a cognitive bias by itself. It's an example of a consequence of a cognitive bias. The cognitive bias here is called the horns effect. The horns effect refers to somebody having little horns. And it describes a phenomenon where if you dislike one characteristic of someone, whether it's their accent, it's something that indicates they're not part of your tribe. Whether it's their accent, their appearance, when you find out about their cultural background, their values, their religion, their politics, it's something that will cause you to have too negative view of their other characteristics, dislike them, distrust them as a whole. And the halo effect is the opposite. So it refers to someone having a little halo on their head. When you like one characteristic of someone, then you'll have too positive view of all of their other characteristics. So you'll have too positive regard for everything about who they are. In the same way, if you have the same cultural background, same appearance, same identity politics, all of these sorts of things, you'll tend to trust them too much for your own good and make judgments around them that are bad for your business relationships. And so either of these deviations, trusting people too much or trusting people too little, trusting people too much based on whether they're part of your tribe, and this is again an example of tribalism, or trusting them too little if they're not part of your tribe, your intuition tells you they're not part of your tribe, is a bad idea. I'll give you an example of a time when this happened, when I was presenting in Columbus, Ohio, to a group of HR professionals in a closing keynote in 2018, so when we still could meet in person. So that closing keynote was at the Regional Diversity and Inclusion Conference for the HR group here in Columbus, Ohio. And if you know anything about Columbus, you'll know that it's very famous as the home of the Ohio State Buckeyes. So we have a lot of pride, go Bucks, it's the college team here. And it's a big deal. We went to the finals of the national championship this year, just beat by Alabama just by a bit. So it's a pretty big deal here. Our big rivals are the University of Michigan Wolverines, And so that is something that you need to know for the context of this presentation, of this moment. Let me share the screen so you could see what I'm talking about here. And I will show you, let's see. I will show you the moment when I was actually talking to them. Fortunately, I have this recorded. So imagine the scene of closing keynote, over 100 HR diversity inclusion professionals in the room. And I asked these folks from the Central Ohio area, overwhelmingly Buckeyes fans, whether they would hire a University of Michigan fan. Again, these are the diversity inclusion professionals, experts who are here at the conference.
So, as you know, I'm a professor at Ohio State. I'm contractually obligated to root for the Buckeyes. I'm guessing there are a lot of Buckeyes fans here, go Bucks, right? Yo, there you go. Now, how likely are you to hire a Michigan fan? See, 3 people. Now,
3 people, over 100 in the audience, over 100 diversity inclusion experts, leaders in diversity inclusion, various prominent companies in the area, and only 3 of them would hire a University of Michigan fan. 3 of them, over 100. Now, I gave them a chance to change their minds. See what happened.
Regardless of how we feel about Michigan fans and their poor choices in which team to root for, does that indicate anything about their performance as an employee? No, I know. Come on, that no should be stronger.
So you can see that they were not willing to change their mind, even when I encouraged them at a diversity inclusion conference, when I was talking about the same, I talked about the halo and horns effect, I talk about this stuff that we're talking about right now, and they were not willing to change their mind. So there you go. This is a powerful example of the halo effect and horns effect in action. This is specifically an example of the horns effect, of course. And the halo effect would have gotten the opposite response if I asked them whether they're more likely to hire a Buckeyes fan. So they are going to be quite a bit more likely to hire a Buckeyes fan than hire someone who's a neutral fan, Alabama fan, or something like that. So now I want you to think about the halo and horns effect in your own organization, in your own work. So your own activities, whether it's within the organization that you run or with clients, vendors of various sorts with whom you interact. Did the whole halo effect or the horns effect ever negatively impact your work? Did that happen to you? Did it ever negatively impact your work? Please go ahead and vote. Tommy, yes, and someone needs to have HR talk to HR. Yeah, then, well, hopefully they learned something from my presentation and are thinking, have thought about it since then. All right, I see 3/4 of you voted. I'll give you 5 more seconds. All right, so the large majority of you, over 90% of you, it happened where you saw the halo effect or the horns effect negatively impact your work. And now that you're aware of these concepts, what's going on, the halo effect and the horns effect, hopefully it will help you notice what's going on and address it effectively. Let's talk a little bit about another pair of cognitive biases, optimism bias and the pessimism bias. The optimism bias and the pessimism bias. This has to do with cognitive diversity. We often think about diversity in terms of appearance, rooting for the team, which team to root for, so our educational background, our cultural background, our social background, but it also applies to our mindsets, the way that we think. The optimism bias has to do with being optimistic around the world. I'm a very optimistic person. It's people who are very creative, entrepreneurial. They are very much opportunity oriented. So I look at the world and I see the grass as green on the other side of the hill. I see the glass as half full, but I'm too risk blind. I tend to not see a lot of problems that actually can come up because of new opportunities, new projects, new initiatives, new relationships. So that's a problem for me in terms of being too optimistic. Pessimism bias is the opposite. It refers to people who see the grass as yellow on the other side of the hill, who see the glass as half empty. They are oriented toward addressing threats, looking for and addressing threats. They stabilize things, they improve them, but they tend to be too risk averse, too likely to see threats and too likely to see them as a bigger deal than they actually are. So both of those are deviations from ideal decision making. Ideally, you'd be splitting down the middle of optimism bias and pessimism bias as an individual, but that's not a great thing for a team. In a team, in a group, when you're thinking about your organization, when you're thinking about your collaborators, you really want to have both on your team. People who are oriented toward too much optimism and people who are oriented to too much pessimism. So you need at least two of each on your team, because otherwise you will have problems in either direction. So I'll give you an example. I run a small company, it has 6 people, may have mentioned the disaster avoidance experts, and I click very much with other optimistic people. Optimists, you have that halo effect going for each other. We like each other, we reinforce each other's ideas. I have 20 ideas before breakfast, and I feel they're all brilliant. Of course, I've learned that they're not all brilliant, but that's how it feels. Now, if I only had other optimists around me, if I only hired other optimists into my company, if I only chose to work with other optimists as my business partners, collaborators, then we'd have 120 ideas before breakfast, six people team, 120 ideas before breakfast, and we'd be reinforcing each other's ideas, and we'd be running in 120 different directions. So that's not a great thing for running a company, right? There's a reason that about half of all small companies, startups, fail within the first 5 years, and 3/4 of them fail within the first 15 years. And this too many projects going on at the same time, not being focused enough, definitely too much optimism is a big reason. People at the top leadership roles in companies tend to be who found them, tend to be entrepreneurially oriented like me. So I found the company, and they tend to be too optimistic, and they tend to hire people in the company who are too optimistic. You really want to make sure to have people on your team who are pessimistic, at least 2 people, so they can help each other and reinforce each other. Because pessimistic people, when I don't click with them well, it's not fun for me to work with them. But when I give them these 20 brilliant ideas, what they say is these are all half-baked potatoes, which doesn't necessarily make me feel good. But what they look at, and they look at these and they say, okay, these 3 are worth finishing baking. So these 3 ideas they choose, they improve them because they are half-baked potatoes. They're great at looking at problems, evaluating them, and noticing here are the problems of all the 17 ideas that are too big to even think about implementing them. But here are these 3. We can fix the problems and we can implement them effectively. They're great at managing and improving. So that's why it's very important to have both types of folks on your team to go forward effectively. So that's the optimism bias and the pessimism bias. And again, this is one of the areas where tribalism might cause problems, where you might hire too many people who are creative and entrepreneurial on your team, and not people who are oriented toward evaluating and improving, or the opposite. If you, let's say, if you have a team of, doesn't tend to apply as much to event professionals, but let's say if you're a group of accountants for an accounting company, they will tend to have people who are very too pessimistic in the team and not creative enough and entrepreneurial enough. I've seen this happen within companies when I work for larger companies. So the financial team, controls team, compliance team has too many pessimists there. So I want you to be thinking about right now whether it would be valuable for you and your team whether if you're a solopreneur, that means to your business collaborators, to investigate and address any negative impacts from the optimism bias or the pessimism bias, whether your own or whether those of other people on the team. I see about half of you voted, so please go ahead, the other half. So Patrick says that that's definitely an experience that he has, that you want to balance out each other. I'll give you 5 more seconds to vote if you haven't made your voice heard yet. All right, so we see that this is an experience that overwhelmingly people have. Over 90% of you have the experience of having a negative impact from the optimism bias or the pessimism bias. So now again, that you're aware of these concepts, hopefully they will help you make better decisions and help you lead your business collaborators, your team members, into making better decisions. Let's talk about how can you overcome these dangerous judgment errors? What are the steps that you can take to address these problems? Optimism bias, pessimism bias, halo effect, Horn's effect, overconfidence bias, and so many more. There are over 100 cognitive biases, as I mentioned. Not all of them are relevant, fully relevant to your work as event professionals and even in the professional settings. But you want to know about these and some others I will talk about. So you want to overcome these dangerous judgment errors. In order to do so, you need to go against your gut. You need to do things that are counterintuitive. They go against your intuition. They go against your gut reactions. They're things that will make you uncomfortable because your gut reaction is telling you to do the opposite. And that's something that you need to realize, that our intuitions, again, were great for that tribal environment where early human beings evolved, but they're not great for in the modern world where we need to make complex decisions and engage effectively with people who are very different than us. And you know what? You've already learned how to do so in a number of areas. You might not even be realizing that you did. For example, think about that savanna environment. In that environment, when we came across a source of sugar, honey, bananas, apples, it was very important for us to have as much of it as possible, stuff our faces, because that's the people who did so were successful in surviving, thriving, and reproducing, carrying their genes forward. We're the descendants of those who are very strongly triggered by sugar. That's a very positive thing for us, for our ancestors. But it's not a positive thing in today's world. So imagine, that there's a grateful vendor has sent you a box of donuts. It's very tempting to take, when you see that box of donuts, delicious box of 12 donuts, to maybe pass by when let's say you're leaving for your team in the break room, or it's in your home in the kitchen, and it's very tempting to take half a donut. And when you take half a donut, it's, you don't want to leave half a donut, so you take another one. So you take the other half of the donut, and then you're kind of getting triggered by sugar. So you take another donut, and then a third one, and then before you know it, half the box is gone. Not that it ever happened to me, right? Or perhaps ice cream is your choice. If you have a carton of ice cream, half gallon of ice cream, did you know that a serving of ice cream is half a cup of ice cream? Half a cup of ice cream, that's what a serving of ice cream is. I don't know who can eat half a cup of ice cream. I haven't yet met this person. So that's a problem in today's world, because in today's world, the refined foods, processed foods, cause us to be strongly triggered by sugar and make bad decisions for our health, for our physical health. So instead of going for those processed, refined, RJB says, does it matter what size cup? No, just the cup, the formal size of cup, whatever it is, compared to ounces. I don't remember the details. But perhaps instead of going for the donuts, you can go for a healthy bowl of fresh fruit that another vendor sent you. So you can pass by the donuts, give them away to somebody else who would enjoy them more, and go for that bowl of fresh fruit. That's a much healthier choice. Or maybe other choices, maybe ordering salad from the place that you ordered, the Grace's Kitchen, Grace that you ordered salads from. Perhaps you make that choice. A much healthier choice than processed donuts. Now, I have to tell you, we're not born loving salad. Nobody loves salad when they're born, when they're a baby. Babies really like candy. And you probably, if babies, you've had that, you've seen them, they really like candy, they like sweets. We're born liking sweets. We're not born liking salad at all. So that's a developed taste. That's a habit that you have to develop. liking salad, ordering salad, enjoying it, passing by the donuts for the fruit. And that's a developed habit for your physical fitness, where you have learned how to go against your gut. We still have an obesity epidemic here in this country, of course, because of the sugar triggering processed foods, but more and more people are able to manage themselves knowing about these triggering and have healthier eating habits. And so you've already learned how to have some healthier eating habits for your physical fitness, and you need to learn yourself and help your team members and collaborators learn how to have healthy mental habits, how to make good decisions. That's what healthy mental habits are. You have physical fitness, you have mental fitness. So mental fitness has to do with learning to overcome your gut intuitions around other people and making good decisions instead, using effective strategies of learning about when your mind is likely to make mistakes and then addressing that problem. So the techniques that you'll use are informed by emotional intelligence and social intelligence. Emotional intelligence and social intelligence. You might have heard about these terms before. So emotional intelligence has to do with yourself. That's about you as a person. It's about being able to be aware of and manage your own emotions. It's about you, your gut reactions, your intuitions, your emotions, whatever you call it. You need to be able to learn how to manage these effectively. So that's in order to address unconscious bias, in order to address bad judgments, improper judgments, problematic judgments around other people. Social intelligence has to do about other people. Now, we are all driven by our emotions, by our intuitions, by our gut reactions. 80 to 90% of our decision-making comes from our gut when we just go forward and let it come, let things go forward as they naturally do. So that's, we have to be aware of for yourself and for other people. And social intelligence is an area of being able to influence them, of being able to be aware of them and manage them, influence other people's emotions, because that's what drives the reactions, and the relationships with you and the relationships with each other. So that's the skill of emotional intelligence and social intelligence. Emotional intelligence and social intelligence, which you need to develop in order to address unconscious bias in yourself and in other people. Let's take a look right now at the poll. And I want to ask you, would it be valuable for you and your team of event professionals, collaborators of various sorts, if you're on a company, or if you're in a company, people within your company, to develop further your emotional intelligence and or your social intelligence? Do you think it would be helpful to develop these for you, to put in some efforts into professional development in these areas? I see about half of you voted, so let's give 5 more seconds for the other half to vote. All right, so taking a look at the results, definitely it seems that it's clear that all of you would believe that it's important to develop your emotional intelligence and social intelligence further, to make good judgments about other people. Great to hear that. So let's talk about how to do so. Again, how to do so has to do with awareness and management. And the first part will be awareness. You have to be aware of where you can go wrong. And in order to be aware of that, you need to assess yourself and quantify yourself. You've probably heard about quantification, assessment of these dangerous judgment errors. There is an assessment on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace that I'll send to those of you who want it after the presentation, that focuses on the 30 most dangerous cognitive biases. I mentioned there are over 100. You can take a look at the list in Wikipedia if you want to see all 100, but I will send you an assessment with the 30 most dangerous ones for you to watch out for and be aware of. It evaluates their extent and their impact on your workplace, their extent and their impact in your workplace, and provides you with clear next steps for addressing them, next steps for addressing each of these cognitive biases. So I'll share the screen and show you what the assessment looks like. And again, I'll send it to you afterwards, so don't worry about it. Now, each question refers to a problem that might occur. It doesn't ask about halo effect, Horn's effect, overconfidence bias, or anything else. It talks about a specific observable behavior, behaviors that you can observe clearly as you engage with people. Your goal is to indicate how often the problem occurred in your workplace in the past year. And that means in your workplace within your company, your team, your organization, or in the way that your people in your team interacted with outside of folks. So whether your clients, whether your vendors, also all of these sorts of things. The answer for each question will be in percentage terms, out of all the times that it can occur, how often did it occur, and you can focus on specific unit within your company or if your organization as a whole, or yourself, or a specific person, whatever seems relevant to you. You don't really want to overthink it. Go with your initial impression. Each question should take 10, 15, 20 seconds. Now I want you to bring up the chat feature at this stage. We'll be using the chat feature for this question. Let's see. Think of all the team conflicts that occurred. All the team conflicts that occurred, and if you're a solopreneur with all your collaborators, think of all the conflicts that occurred. What percentage of them occurred because someone overestimated how effective they are in their communication or their persuasiveness? How many of them, of all the conflicts, 10, 20 in the past year, 30, how many of them occurred because someone overestimated how effective they are in communicating and persuading others? Please go ahead and chat. 75%, 80%. So that's RJB, 75%, Kelsey, 80%, Amy, 50%, Shelly, 70%, Valiant says 90%. So pretty high numbers. Pam says 75%, Kirsha says 60%. So this has to do with a cognitive bias known as illusion of transparency. Illusion of transparency. When we communicate, it's very intuitive to us. Our gut intuition says that the other person hears 100% of our message. Whatever we're communicating, the other person hears 100% of the message, 100% of the message. Unfortunately, that's not the case. They don't hear 100% of the message. And it's also very intuitive for us to feel that they internalize 100% of the message. They accept it, they internalize it. That's how it feels to us, our gut intuition. In reality, in the modern digital world, there's a lot, we're communicating by Zoom, other video conference, or by email. There's a lot that can be missed. Things can be easily misread in emails when emails run too long or sometimes cut off or something like that. People miss things very easily. And in Zoom video conferences, there are technical glitches all the time or something going on in somebody's background that cause them to miss a part of your message. Even in in-person meetings, of course, someone can be distracted. They can be thinking about an important meeting with a vendor or so what they'll be having for lunch that day. So someone can be distracted in the moment as well, looking at their phone or something like that. And they can also, of course, not internalize your message. They can look at you and they can nod and they can seem like they're agreeing, but they can completely disagree and they may be ignoring what you're saying. They may think it's irrelevant for them. That is a problem. That is a problem called the illusion of transparency. Now, when you're thinking about your company, this assessment, if you're in the 10 to 20% range of the questions, that's not such a big deal for the answer. If you would say 10 to 20% of team conflicts occurred because of this. If you're in the 20 to 30% range, that becomes a moderate problem. If you're over 30%, that becomes a serious problem and something to address. So especially when you're over 30% on the assessment, when you're going to go through the assessment, look at the questions. When you're over 30% on any question, that's definitely something for you to be thinking about addressing pretty quickly. I'm going to ask you about another one that you probably are already aware of and thinking about. Number three. So we talked about overconfidence bias. In all significant decisions, in what percentage of cases over the last year was someone overconfident about the decision in your workplace? What percentage of cases was someone overconfident about the decision? Okay, Amy says 90%. RJB says 60%. Valia 60%. Kirsha 30%. Kelsey 50%. Tommy 50%. Okay, so this is obviously the overconfidence bias, so you already know about this one. And yes, Patrick says 80% COVID is supposed to be done, right? Becca says 80%. So this is something that you really need to be thinking about, overconfidence. If you're over 30% on this question, you definitely want to be realizing the overconfidence bias is causing you and people in your workplace to make bad decisions because they're overconfident about things and making plans that are too overconfident, making bad decisions around people, unconscious bias around projects, like COVID is supposed to be done, underestimating the length time of these sorts of things. Now, that's 2 out of 28 questions, and you'll get the rest, 28 more questions. You'll get the assessment later, the full assessment. In the meantime, I want to ask you, as you're thinking about the assessment, do you think having you and your team take the assessment and address the cognitive biases it uncovers, like illusion of transparency, overconfidence bias, and so on, would help improve your success as an event professional? Do you think it would be helpful for you as an event professional to do so? See, about 3/4 of you voted. Rachel RJB feels so strongly that she says yes in the chat. Great. 5 more seconds for folks who didn't answer yet. 5 more seconds. All right, so clearly this is something that everyone feels would be a value for them, and that's excellent. So again, for those who indicate they want it, I'll send it to you after the presentation. Great. Now, that's about awareness. I talked about awareness. How do you get awareness of whether for emotional intelligence within yourself or social intelligence about others? And the cognitive bias, the assessment has questions that relate to both. The other is how to address these problems, how to address the problems in your decision-making around other people. And you can also apply this to all sorts of other decisions. I'll give you a quick technique that you can use 5 to 10 times a day as you're making decisions that you don't want to screw up. These are decisions, again, you want to avoid, these are decisions where you want to avoid disasters. This is not a decision where you want to make the perfect decision, the ideal decision, a major decision about your company, whether sell your company, buy a company, something about a key, let's say, business partnership. You want to take in a business partner. You probably don't want to use this technique. And there are other techniques that I can advise that you use. You can contact me later. But this is for those questions where good enough is good enough, where though you just don't want to screw up, want to make sure that you don't make a bad decision and that you make a good enough decision. So this is good enough decisions. The first out of 5 questions that you need to ask to make a good enough decision is, what important information didn't I yet fully consider? What important evidence didn't you take into account? It's very tempting for us to look only for evidence that aligns with what we already feel, what our gut tells us is the right thing to do. Buy, sell, whatever, work with a certain vendor, take on clients, go for a certain market, not go for a certain market, whatever. It's very tempting for us to do that. And we need to look twice as hard for evidence that would disconfirm our beliefs, prove that we're wrong. If we can't prove that we're wrong, that's great, we're more likely to be right. If we can't prove that we're wrong, that's great too, because we're not going to make a screwy decision. The other part of this question is important information. You don't want to be looking for information that doesn't have too much of a relevance for making the decision. And also it depends on how large the decision is. If it's a couple of $100, you probably don't want to be spending a bunch of hours looking for the information for a couple of $100 decision. But if it's in the dozens of thousands, then you probably want to be spending many hours looking for information to make the decision. So it depends on the importance of the decision. If you want to decide what information would be important and how much information would be important to find. Then, what dangerous judgment errors didn't I yet fully consider? If this is about team conflict and communication and the illusion of transparency, if this is about evaluating business relationships, halo effect and horns effect, and so many others. As you go through the assessment and you become familiar with these dangerous judgment errors, you'll be able to quickly bring these to mind about any decision. Next, what would a trusted and objective advisor suggest I do? What would that little angel on your shoulder suggest you do in this situation? Maybe think about what someone in your ILEA group would tell you to do, who you trust and who would be a good advisor to you. Maybe there's a mentor figure that you work with. Maybe there's a coach that you work with. So folks like this, think about what they would tell you to do in this situation. You get about 50% of the benefit by just asking this question. And you get the other 50% of the benefit by calling this person. So you can do that too, if the decision is big enough. Next, you're going over to the more of the implementation stage, although still on the decision-making stage. How have you addressed all the ways this decision can fail, is the 4th question. How have you addressed all the ways it can go wrong? That's a really important question to ask. Imagine it goes completely wrong, completely screwy. think about the reasons why it goes wrong. Why did it fail? And then try to solve these problems in advance. If there's enough problems that you can't solve in advance and they seem quite realistic, maybe you want to revisit the decision in the first place. But what will often happen is that you will save the decision at the implementation stage, where as you're implementing it, you can put in ideas to solve problems in advance of the problems occurring. Next, what new information would cause me to revisit this decision? What would cause you to change your mind about this decision? Once we make a decision, it's really hard for us to revisit the decision. It's called post-factum rationalization. After we make a decision, we rationalize the reasons why we made the decision after it. We are attached to the decision. But if you integrate into the decision information that would cause you to change your mind, that's a much, much more healthy approach to decision making. Because then you could say, okay, I will revisit it if this information comes up. If I find out certain things about these vendors as I'm researching them, or if you say something like, at a certain time, if COVID doesn't seem like it's getting better in 2 months, then I will delay a certain event, something like this, something that you can actually use. Or let's say the new variants, if the new variants start causing, right now we're at a plateau of cases, maybe around something like 60,000 a day on average. Last time I checked, which was this morning. So 60,000 a day on average. If we start to go up, then that might be a time to think about, okay, maybe delaying an event or something like that. So thinking about things like this, what kind of information would cause you to change your mind? And this is, again, something you can do by yourself 5 to 10 times a day, or something you can do with a team. If you're doing this with a team, it's really helpful to have folks, the other people, answer these questions and yourself answer it in advance, and then structure the decision-making meeting around the agenda of sharing your answer to these questions and going through them one by one. That's such an efficient decision-making technique. It's super helpful. I've seen teams cut down the decisions by 60%, decision-making meetings by 60% by using this technique, because you don't go off into rambling corners and things that don't really matter too much. All right. Same deal with the 5 questions polling. Do you think having you and your team use the 5 questions technique to avoid bad decision would help improve your success as an event professional? Do you think using these techniques for you and your team would help you improve your success as an event professional? See, half of you voted. Let's give you 5 more seconds. 5 more seconds to make your voice heard. Please go ahead and vote. Excellent. So we see that everyone sees that they would be helpful for improving your success as an event professional. It's exciting. Great. I will send you a decision aid to use for you to use yourself and send to your team for using these 5 questions. All right. And here we're coming to the resources section that I mentioned, the resources that you'll get after the presentation, for those who want them, of course, 3 additional resources. The assessment on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace is one of them. So the assessment that you saw and that large majority of you perceive as valuable. Then the decision aid on 5 key questions to avoid decision disasters. Next, sample chapters from my best-selling book, The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships. And finally, a free coaching session with me on integrating these techniques into your work. I have 3 open slots, so it's going to be first come, first serve, whoever claims them. I'll send you an email after the presentation, after I get the email list of people who want the resources, and that's going to be, you'll just respond to it. There's going to be a scheduling link, so if you can schedule the free skill, there's still, well, some of these sessions are open. All right, so how many of you would like these free resources? Please go ahead and vote. Would you like the free post-training resources? Please go ahead and vote in the poll. And while folks are voting, I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Gleb. This was incredible. We really appreciate it. It was so much helpful information. I feel like, in this realm of DEI and really understanding unconscious bias, I really appreciate kind of the data and, the pessimism versus optimism and horns and halos, offering these like different perspectives and different ways to think of things. Because I agree, I do think that race and someone's appearance is usually what we're talking about at the forefront, and it is so important, but this is also an important factor in our hiring practices. We do have some questions here. So one of the first ones was, how would you suggest my business team develop our emotional intelligence together? I know that, like, you know, in this world that we live in professionally, we do try and keep that separate. So what are your takes on adding kind of that social emotional intelligence to our interdepartmental interactions?
What I would encourage you to do is take the assessment for your whole team and then discuss it. Not simply take it and use it as a baseline, but actually discuss it and discuss the questions that are problematic. For example, if you have a high score on the illusion of transparency, that means that people don't have sufficient emotional intelligence around their effective communication to others. So you want to discuss this as an issue, and awareness of this. It's like, oh, I thought this is what I heard you say. Things like this, things where you're missing each other, would help you develop your emotional intelligence in that one. The same goes for all the other questions, for overconfidence bias and so on. Where are you too confident? That has to do with your emotions. Oh, that's your emotional intelligence of overconfidence. So that would be a strong suggestion that I would have, that you want to specifically address what are your areas of weakness in emotional intelligence? What are your cognitive biases? The optimism and the pessimism, which of you, people often don't know that they're too optimistic or they're pessimistic. They just feel this is the right way to be. And what results from that is optimistic people too often shooting from the hip and giving off too many half-baked ideas that aren't thought through, and pessimistic people being just Mrs. No or Mr. No, just kind of opposing those ideas. And that's not a helpful way of collaborating at all. The way that I mentioned before is much more helpful, where you separate the idea generation and the idea evaluation. So that's an example of where you are getting more information and developing your emotional intelligence around where you are weak and where other people are weak, and how can you improve these things together.
That's a great point that you made. I love that conversation starter. I think that I'm just going to speak for my own company, that can also be very uncomfortable. You know, we have a very small team, and having this very open conversation of, these are my, I don't know, shortcomings is the wrong term, but this is where I need to grow, or this is where I can expand. Would you recommend, I know that not every company has the budget to bring in like a formal facilitator or some sort of safe, like stranger, for lack of a better word, that's like not in it. So someone like yourself coming in, you know, are there kind of halfway points besides bringing in a full facilitator or someone to come in and kind of do an emotional overhaul? Are there other, besides the assessment itself, like, are there other tools or ways that aren't so, I don't know, because there may not be buy-in initially for everyone to come to the table ready to go. You know what I mean?
So the assessment itself is helpful. You can use the assessment by itself with people and not have the conversation as a first step. So there are other tools that I don't want to go into, because I find that a little bit of knowledge is more dangerous than a lot of knowledge.
Yeah, agreed.
And so that's, you can contact me. We can have a coaching session about this. Whoever is interested in, again, this is a free coaching session, one of the 3 things, and I can talk about other tools. I just don't want to go in depth into them, because if I don't discuss them, I would feel uncomfortable recommending them.
Yeah, no, I totally understand.
So a helpful step might be for people to take the assessment themselves without having that discussion, because that improves their awareness of what's going on, what's happening. You can also, you definitely can use the facilitator. Another thing that's helpful is just having someone from your ILEA NCC group, one of the board members, one of the experienced people, come in and serve as a volunteer facilitator. I'm sure this could be something that people would be excited to do who are in a leadership role in ILEA NCC. So that's something I would recommend as well.
That's a great point. Thank you so much, Dr. Gleb. I'm sure that there are several of us that would be totally happy to come in kind of an unbiased, ironically, perspective and offer that. This ties into that. A person on my team is too confident, but tends to not pull their weight. How do I approach someone in a situation like this?
That would be something. So I like using the assessment in this example because
Okay.
that would be something that is a conversation that gets out. What is likely happening is that they're unaware of what's
Mhm.
going on. And other people pointing out the situation would be able to help them. Okay, this is an issue. These are problems. How can we address these problems together? So you're not in as much of an awkward situation when you're pointing this out yourself. This is something where the assessment can help bring out these conversations. But do keep this in mind as something you want to bring up. So when the overconfidence bias comes up, that is something that you want to talk about as an issue, where not pointing out this person by name or something like this, but how many of you feel that there are some people who are on the team who are not pulling their weight as much as they should? And that would be a conversation that goes into the direction that you want to lead it.
I appreciate that, because I think that's the biggest part of this thing, is we were so excited to have you, because I do think that a lot of this conversation is very emotional. It's very personal. It's very intimate. And so, for lack of a better word, having the data, being able to use these numbers and really have an honest conversation in that way makes it less stressful, and there's less pressure because there's numbers here. And I agree. I think it offers a lot of opportunity. In terms of events specific, we have a question here that says, in the events industry, we frequently need to make very quick decisions that impact many people. Is there a way to quickly take into account these biases when making those decisions in like a gut check moment? I know that you offered those 5 tools, but I don't know. I guess it's just a practice. It's like a muscle,
Sure.
right?
Yes. So the 5 questions are something that I would recommend if you have 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Essentially, once you have a habit of using these questions, there's a similar set of questions, 3 questions that were developed for firefighters in the UK. Now, there was a study showing that firefighters in the UK, about 80% of the mistakes that happened were because of human error in firefighting. So the heat of the moment, right? Literally.
Yeah.
And questions were developed for firefighting leaders to use to ask themselves before they send their team into the fire. So once they got into the habit and they learned how to ask these questions, they made their decisions in the same amount of time as people who weren't trained to make these decisions, but they made much fewer mistakes. So that is something that you can definitely develop that habit by asking these 5 questions, and then you'll be able to ask them very quickly in the heat of the moment. So that's one thing that I would say about the 5 questions. The other thing would be taking this assessment specifically for yourself, not for your broader team, and being aware as you take it of your own personal peccadillos, your own predilections, your own cognitive biases, which ones are most problematic for you. For me, the optimism bias, as I mentioned, is one of the biggest ones.
Yeah.
So now knowing about that, I always make a very quick check for when I have ideas, when I have notions, when I communicate to other people, when I write an email. It's very tempting for me to make it creative, entrepreneurial, not think about all the problems with the email, not think about the ways it might be misread or misheard in something like this. So, for example, or doing a presentation, not thinking about various aspects of what might be going on. I remember I'm doing a presentation at the Forum for Workplace Inclusion on March 9th, which is one of the largest inclusion conferences in the world. And I was talking about making binary decisions, how that's a bad idea. So the first thing I was writing in these slides was, you shouldn't make black and white decisions. But then black and white, I'm like, wait, I'm going to go through this again and think about that. That's probably not the best way of framing it in an inclusion presentation.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I don't see the threat immediately. But
Certainly.
now I can think, okay, what are the ways that people can misread it? And so then I can check for that. So you want to be aware of similar things for yourself. Maybe you're too pessimistic, and then you're not open to ideas sufficiently, and that will be a problem, and so on. So all of these sorts of things, maybe you want to be thinking about the halo effect, where you might be suffering from a halo effect from someone, or the horns effect. Knowing about these for yourself will be really helpful for you.
That's awesome. Thank you for that feedback. Here's a great one that actually lends to that. Many groups and companies are looking at DEI through the lens of skin and sexuality specifically and only. Do you have any advice on how to approach this topic of expanding?
Absolutely. So you want to be talking about other decisions that are bad and good. So the optimism bias and the pessimism bias are specifically things that I brought up because people mostly think about it through skin color, sexuality, and that is a problem. You're not noticing other areas where there's discrimination, where if you are too optimistic, and you will tend to hire or bring in too many optimistic people on your team and discriminate against people who are pessimistic, and vice versa. So you want to be thinking about how to bring up this topic. The example with the Buckeyes team, right? Buckeyes versus Michigan, versus the Wolverines. That is another example of why I wanted to bring it up, where it comes up in so many other areas where you're not thinking about it. So you want to bring this information to the awareness of companies, of leaders, of folks in HR, that this is an area that is bigger than simply appearance, sexuality. There are many other areas where you want to be thinking about cognitive diversity, for example, the optimism and pessimism bias, cultural background, educational background, all of these sorts of things.
There's a new wave going through companies in the last couple of years, heavily relying on personality tests, whether it be Myers-Briggs or the Think, Feel, Know, or whatever classification. Where does all of that factor into these hiring practices and kind of recruitment? How do you think that they work? Do you think, are bits and pieces good? Or what's the best way? I know that some folks will make this heavy investment in relying on this to kind of create their team, and then they're kind of in it. So what's, a good solution, I guess, a happy medium to get to have the best of everything?
So the first thing is to look at tests that actually show themselves to be scientifically valid. For example, MBTI has not been shown to not be scientifically valid. The Myers-Briggs assessment. I'm sorry for those folks who love it. It's something. The problem with it is that it doesn't refer to actual categories. Everything except introversion, extroversion is essentially made up. Where if you take the test at different times, you will test at different aptitudes. And that's been shown to really be a problem. The best of these tools is called the Big Five, and that has been shown to be scientifically validated, meaning that their categories there are referring to actual personality traits that are important for people and categorize people. So if you want to use it and you're not currently using something, I would recommend the Big Five. That's something that has been shown to be validated by extensive research. So that's one. The second thing, if you're already using it, if you are into it, the thing that you don't want to do is use it as a selector. That's not something that's helpful. You can use it as a way of prompting conversations, of saying, okay, here are tendencies that people have, but not trying to label people. Because again, people at different times, at different stages in their career, different ages, these things change. There are some basic things that are in the Big Five that don't change. So the Big Five would talk about things like introversion and extroversion. That doesn't change. People can learn to act more introverted. Yes, the Big Five assessment. That's right, Becca. So the people can learn to act more introverted or more extroverted, but that's not what an introversion and extroversion actually refers to. It refers to where you get energy. So if you're introverted, you get more energy from being alone. If you're extroverted, you get more energy from being with other people. So that's what introversion extroversion refers to. With the Big Five, there's kind of the other things that are validated. But for MBTI, for things like this, you want to be thinking of judgment, thinking, feeling, not referring to real categories. But if you are using it, you just want to be using it as a conversation starter. Here's a way that I think here are my preferences.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. One last question. Sure. I think we'll have caught them all. And I think this is a great one. What's the best way to translate this information to families or to children? I know that this is, again, in kind of raising this next generation, I think that, that's something that folks are really looking for, if there are resources that you can share.
Sure. So you see the sample chapters from my best-selling book, Blind Spots Between Us. That talks about not simply professional relationships, but that talks about personal relationships, whether romantic relationships, whether you're with your friends, whether you're with your family. It talks about all sorts of relationships, the cognitive biases there, and how you can address them. Of course, this applies to the halo and horns effect, all of these sorts of things, overconfidence. That applies to a lot of problems. Optimism. My wife is, for example, very pessimistic, and it was hard for me when I first began my relationship with her, because I'm a person who loves surprises. I really enjoy them. This is a big fan, but she doesn't like surprises because she's pessimistic, and so that is a problem for her. And when I was in my beginning of my relationship with her, we've been together, oh gosh, no. So we've been together for 23 years. And so I did not know about any of this stuff when I was 17 and beginning my relationship with her. And so that caused me to make a lot of bad decisions in that immediate early stages in the relationship, which I learned about later. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is why I was screwing up.
That's great. That's so awesome. Thank you again for your time, Dr. Gleb. Folks, if we can give like a silent round of applause, this was so incredible. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your time and your knowledge, your data. We are so grateful for the resources that you'll be sharing later. And so for those of you that have signed up, we will be sharing a huge list of resources with Dr. Gleb. Please sign up for those coachings. Obviously, he will be a wealth of knowledge. But yeah, after that, Tommy, I'm going to hand it off to you. We'll go out to our breakout sessions. Thank you, Dr. Gleb, again.
Thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Gleb. That was awesome. And very, now I'm thinking about all the different ways I can bring this into my own personal life. I mean, from career to just my 1-year project in my backyard. How many wrong decisions have I made there? So we are going to go to breakout rooms now. Lori is going to send us into some breakout rooms. And here's a little icebreaker question. Do you feel you are too confident in your judgments? So that's where we're going to kick it off. So